90 is the only psalm that we're told was written by Moses. So this makes it, of the psalms that are listed as having an author, this makes it the oldest psalm. To put it this way, that there's as much of a time difference between David, who lived around the year 1000 or 1050, there's a much time difference between David and Moses as there is from me and you to Shakespeare. God is eternal. Even that which we think of as old is very new. But then he goes a bit further. Did you notice verse 4 in particular? We like to cite this. 1,000 days in your sight is like a day. You know, we have a lot of words for the periods of history. You know, we talk about the medieval era. You know, we talk about the Renaissance. We talk about the Reformation era. We talk about the early modern period. We talk about the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment and then the postmodern period. All these terms that we use to describe 100 years for God is like 2 hours. All the wars and the pestilence for 1,000 years for God, we're told here, is like a sigh. Literally like breathing out. All that history, like one time exhaling. Think of all the great minds. You know, we name schools after them. You had Anselm and Aquinas and Luther, right? And all the great philosophers, Kant and the thinkers like Freud and the politicians and the dynasties, Henry VIII and Louis XIV and Churchill and so on. You know, all those lives, from God's perspective, like a little flame just snuffed out as if it's nothing. See, 1,000 years for God, like a watch in the night. You know, however old the earth is, it's very, very young. It's like a night watch. It's like a sigh. It's like a whisper compared to who God is and how he looks at history. So we get a scope as to what it means to be eternal. We have these iniquities that are before God. Even our secret sins are in the light of his presence, verse 8. All of us have these things in our life that we're ashamed of, that we think only we know, or maybe a few others know, or you know, that we try to repress out of our memories, and we just hope that no one will ever find out about them. And you know, we just want to forget and move on with our lives. But we realize something like verse 8, that nothing is lost on God, that he remembers it all, he sees it all, the light of his presence. All he needs to do is just to kind of gaze at it, you know, in the light of his very being, exposes everything that is true. Spurgeon, the great 19th century preacher, called the Prince of Preachers, in his commentary, he summed up this section of Psalm 90. He said, human beings are troubled, transitory, and sinful. So isn't that true, if we're honest? That we face a lot of trouble in this life, even if you have a relatively good life, like I'm guessing most of us do, you know, Northeast Ohio, and we have things like refrigerators and roofs over our heads and clothes. Even if you have it better than most of the world, life is still very challenging and often painful. Then no one in the room disputes that we're transitory. That is, we're just passing through for a short period of time, especially in light of eternity, which is established in the first two verses, and then also that we're sinful. That we look out for ourselves, and the world has a lot wrong with it, mainly because we have turned away from God and clenched our fist at him. You might know the hymn. It's, if you grew up in church, the first line is, "O God, our help in ages past." That entire hymn is based on Psalm 90. But look at what Watts writes in one of the stanzas. Time, like an ever-rolling stream, bears all its sons away. They fly forgotten as a dream dies at the opening day. My grandmother, she grew up down around Steubenville in a little place called Wellsville, Ohio, on the river, and we'd go down about once a year, and we would go to this church that she grew up in, and a lot of her ancestors, my ancestors, forebears, had gone to this church. And what you'll notice about almost any church that was built 100 years ago is that in order to get into the church, you go through a graveyard. That's by design. That in order to get into the church to hear what God had to say, you had to walk past all the tombstones. So you could imagine, right? That you have this small village, everyone walks to church, and you say, oh, I remember her when we worshiped with her, and I remember him, and there's a dash between two dates. See, in those days, you were prepared, right? You said that I know that my day too is coming, that I will one day there will be a funeral for me, that I'm walking through the graveyard, I'm thinking about death, and only God is the one who knows and in whom I can have refuge. So whether we think about it or not, the hard truth comes in verse 10. Our years come to 70, or maybe, if you're fortunate, if you really work at it, maybe 80. I find that remarkable. That line of poetry is 3,500 years old, and it's true. I think at this point, I hope that if nothing else, these middle verses of Psalm 90 have humbled us. that I will die, that my greatest life achievement will be filled with sorrow and trouble, that I'm a sinful person and have provoked the wrath of God, and there's no way out on my own merit, is what it says. But notice then what the psalm does, is that it boomerangs us back into the person of God. Do you notice all the words then used from 13 and forward about God, right? That he's compassionate, right? That he's a God of unfailing love, that in him is joy and gladness, that he's the one that can make all of our works count, right? Anything that we do, it's only by his mercy and his grace. And so the psalm, right, once we recognize our own state of being very much in trouble and very frail and very weak and like a blade of grass that's about to wither, the only conclusion is that without turning back to the eternal God, the God of compassion, then I'm not going to be able to face another day. And so how much better to say, Lord, you've provided a way out of this life of really hardship and the fate of death by the person of Jesus. As we sang in that last psalm, right? Jesus is alive, that he came and he paid the penalty on the cross for us, that we trust in him. Say, God, you're the one who, you've dealt with the sin problem in Jesus, that my punishment has been paid by Jesus, that no matter what my work is this side of heaven, that it doesn't matter because Jesus is going to take me home. So the great mantra of the Christian, right, is that we're not afraid of death. That we know exactly where we're going. Where, O death, is thy victory? Where, O death, is thy sting? Right? When we're in Christ, we need not to be afraid of these things, but we say we recognize our own limitations. We see that God is the only one who can get us out, that he's done so in Jesus. And when we're in Christ, that we then, in verse 12, can number our days and live as wise people. I mean, verse 12 really is kind of what we should leave with our minds on, right? That we're to number our days. Each day is a gift. That all of us are a steward of our time. 1 Corinthians 4:2, that each of us has been given a stewardship. This day, all of us has to have the present day. Are we going to use it to be consumers? Or are we going to use it to be investors for God's sake?